The routine at the cafe was a refuge of predictability. Every day, I arrived early, even before the sun rose, to prepare the place. The smell of freshly ground coffee mixed with the cold morning air as the yellow lights softly illuminated the dark wooden tables. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where familiar faces and repeated orders created a sense of comfort, almost as if each day was just an extension of the previous one. The regular customers arrived punctually, their entrances marked by the gentle chime of the bell at the door. First came the elderly lady, always well-dressed, who never failed to order her cappuccino with a touch of cinnamon. Next, the hurried businessman, with his leather briefcase, barely lifted his eyes from his phone as he ordered his double espresso. And so the day went on, in a calm cadence that allowed me to predict every interaction, every word exchanged. Then, on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, the bell at the door rang a little differently. I looked up, expecting to see another familiar face, but instead, a man I had never seen before walked in. He moved with a calculated calm, his steps firm but unhurried, as if each movement was carefully planned. There was something about him that immediately caught my attention, though I couldn't pinpoint why. He didn't look like the other customers. His face was hard to read, marked by features that didn't stand out, yet seemed to hide something. He wore simple clothes, with no distinctive details, which only added to the aura of mystery around him. When he reached the counter, I remained silent for a moment, trying to understand what was making me feel that slight unease. "Good afternoon," he finally broke the silence, his voice smooth and polite. But there was a coldness in the way he spoke, a distance that made me hesitate before responding. "Good afternoon," I replied, trying to keep a professional tone. "First time here?" He nodded, his eyes fixed on mine, as if he was analyzing my every reaction. "Yes, it's my first time. I'm looking for something different. What would you recommend?" His words were ordinary, a question I heard every day, but the way he pronounced them seemed to carry more weight, as if he was talking about more than just coffee. Keeping a smile on my face, I began listing some of the house specialties, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being evaluated in a way that went beyond the usual. "Our vanilla latte is quite popular, or if you prefer something stronger, the classic espresso is always a good choice." He continued to stare at me for a few more seconds, as if deciding something important. "I'll have the vanilla latte," he finally said, his tone still low, almost hypnotic. As I prepared the coffee, a growing discomfort washed over me, as if his eyes were still on me, even as he waited patiently at the counter. Every move I made seemed to be meticulously observed, and this excessive attention began to unsettle me in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the fact that he was a new customer, it was something more, something I couldn't name. I handed him the coffee, trying not to show my discomfort. He took the cup with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and for a moment, our fingers touched. A shiver ran through me, an involuntary reflex that made me pull back slightly. "Thank you," he said, still with that incomplete smile, before moving away to choose a table in the furthest corner of the cafe, where the shadows seemed deeper. I continued my work, trying to focus on the other customers, but my eyes kept drifting back to that dark corner. He was there, sitting with a relaxed posture, but with a gaze that never stopped examining the environment, as if he was studying every detail. He drank the coffee slowly, unhurried, prolonging his presence in a way that made time seem to drag. Each passing second increased the feeling that something was out of place, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Finally, he finished. Without saying a word, he got up, placed the money on the table, and left, the doorbell ringing softly as he departed. But the silence he left behind didn't bring the relief I had hoped for. On the contrary, the feeling of discomfort lingered, taking root deep in my mind. Something about that man had stirred something within me, something I couldn't shake, even after he was gone. I tried to get back to work, trying to ignore the persistent feeling that, somehow, my peaceful routine had been irrevocably disturbed. And even as I attended to the customers who came after him, an invisible shadow seemed to have settled in the cafe, a shadow I knew wouldn't disappear so easily. The following days passed slowly, almost dragging, with that unsettling feeling growing inside me. The routine that once calmed me now felt like a burden, a sequence of actions I performed almost mechanically. Every morning, I would open the cafe with a certain unease, knowing that at some point, he would show up again. And as if he could sense my fear, he didn't take long to arrive. Always the same way, with calculated steps and a gaze that followed me around the room. At first, he ordered the same coffee, the vanilla latte I had recommended, but now he made it a point to ask for different suggestions, as if trying to prolong the conversation in any way he could. In the beginning, I tried to convince myself that he was just a curious customer, but with each passing day, his behavior seemed more sinister. The fixed stares were the worst. He never took his eyes off me while I prepared his coffee, and every time I looked up, I found his eyes watching me with an uncomfortable intensity. I felt as if he was trying to penetrate my thoughts, trying to understand something that even I couldn't explain. He didn't need to say anything to make me feel small, exposed. It was as if I were a piece in a game he was playing, a game whose rules I didn't know. The smaller details also began to bother me. Sometimes, he would linger while paying, his hands holding mine for a second longer than necessary. On other occasions, he would leave the money on the counter, but always in a way that forced me to get closer to pick it up, creating a proximity I didn't want. His fingers, cold and pale, seemed to be everywhere, leaving invisible traces on everything they touched. What disturbed me the most, however, were the questions. At first, they were harmless, about the cafe or the coffee itself. But soon, they became more personal, subtle but invasive. He would ask about my schedule, what I did after work, where I lived. I answered as minimally as possible, keeping the responses vague, but I felt that he absorbed every word, every detail, as if he were building a mental map of my life. It was as if he were trying to invade my space, crossing boundaries that I couldn't prevent. The atmosphere of the cafe, which had once been a refuge for me, began to change. The shadows seemed to lengthen on the walls, and the air, once welcoming with the aroma of coffee, now felt heavy, almost suffocating. I felt a constant shiver down my spine, as if something were always behind me, watching, waiting. The yellow light from the lamps, which once created an inviting ambience, now seemed to cast unsettling shadows over the furniture, bringing to life things that shouldn't be there. When he entered, the sound of the doorbell was different, a sharp sound that cut through the air and made my stomach turn. I knew he was there even before I looked. It was as if his presence altered the energy of the place, making the environment dense, charged with something I couldn't name. Every time I served his coffee, I felt a weight in my chest, as if I were handing over something more than just a cup. I started avoiding being alone in the cafe, especially during the times when he usually appeared. I would find excuses to go to the stockroom or to call a colleague to the counter, but it seemed like he always knew when I was alone. He would show up at those moments, as if waiting patiently, like a predator who knows its prey's habits well. My mind began to play tricks on me. I felt as if he were everywhere, even when he wasn't. Sometimes, at night, when I closed the cafe and walked down the deserted streets to my home, I had the feeling that I was being followed. I would turn quickly, only to find the street empty, but the fear never left me. At home, I would lock all the windows and doors more forcefully than necessary, trying to push away the idea that, somehow, he was closer than I imagined. The place I loved, where I spent most of my days, now seemed threatening. I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know who to tell. It was a silent terror, subtle but constant, that seeped into every aspect of my life. The cafe, once a refuge of tranquility, had become a trap, and without realizing it, I was becoming more and more ensnared, not knowing how to escape. That night seemed darker than usual, as if the shadows had swallowed all the light. The street, usually quiet at that hour, was more deserted than ever. I had closed the cafe late on other occasions, but that night, something was different. The air was dense, heavy, and each step I took echoed on the sidewalk with a hollow and lonely sound. A shiver ran down my spine as I adjusted my coat and began to walk towards my house. The silence was unsettling, almost deafening. My heart was pounding, and every second I felt fear taking hold of me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a night like any other, that I was imagining things. But there was something in that darkness that seemed alive, something that watched me from the darkest corners, waiting for me to make a mistake. Picking up my pace, I tried to push away the paranoid thoughts, focusing on the idea of getting home as quickly as possible. However, before I could fully convince myself that I was safe, a sound began to echo through the street: footsteps. Initially, they were almost imperceptible, but soon they became clearer, rhythmically striking the sidewalk, synchronized with mine. I stopped abruptly, and the footsteps ceased. A chill gripped me. It was as if the air around me had frozen. I turned slowly, hoping to see nothing, but there he was. At the end of the street, under the dim light of a flickering street lamp, a figure stood still. Even from a distance, something about the way he positioned himself, shoulders slightly hunched forward, seemed familiar to me. The sensation of déjà vu hit me hard, and I immediately knew I had seen that profile before. But with the darkness distorting the shapes, I couldn't be sure. The fear, already lurking, exploded in my mind. My legs began to move on their own, speeding away from that spot. The sound of my footsteps echoed even louder now, almost like a hammering against the pavement. The figure behind me seemed to have noticed my fear, because soon the footsteps echoed again, this time faster, matching the frantic rhythm of my own. I tried to keep a cool head, telling myself that it might just be a coincidence, that it could be anyone returning home late, just like me. But instinct screamed something else, and terror began to dominate my thoughts. Each second seemed to stretch out, and the street ahead of me felt infinite. The fear of looking back and confirming that he was following me became unbearable, but I knew I had to see. I had to see. My heart was pounding so hard that I felt like it would explode. I gathered the courage and quickly glanced over my shoulder. He was closer now, still at a distance, but clearly following the same path as me. As I hurried more and more, the sound of footsteps behind me seemed closer, almost as if he was about to catch up with me. The air around me was heavy, each breath felt like a monumental effort, and my lungs burned from the strain. My heart pounded in my chest, and the adrenaline made my hands tremble. All I wanted was to get home, lock the door, and hide from this nightmare that seemed never-ending. When I finally saw my building, I almost let out a sigh of relief. But before I could get close enough, I felt a presence right behind me, and the desperation that was already at unbearable levels reached its peak. Something in my mind screamed that I needed to run faster, but my body was already at its limit. That's when I heard a voice, low and disturbingly calm, call my name. I turned instinctively, my eyes wide with fear, and there he was, the new customer from the cafe, just a few steps away. He had caught up with me. His figure was partially shrouded in shadows, but I could clearly see his face. There was something deeply wrong in his expression, something that intensified the terror inside me. His smile, which had once seemed harmless, now carried a hidden malice. He said something, but my ears were ringing with panic, and his words were lost in the chaos of my mind. I tried to focus on what he was saying, but all I could think about was how to escape. His tone was calm, almost comforting, as if we were having a casual conversation at the cafe. But the look in his eyes told a completely different story. They were fixed on me, as if I were a cornered animal. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel the pulse in my temples, and each passing second made me feel even more vulnerable. Suddenly, he took a step towards me, and my body went into survival mode. Terrified, I stepped back, trying to create distance, but he kept approaching, his hands outstretched as if he wanted to grab me. Everything in me screamed to run, to get out of there as fast as possible. Then, in a final burst of desperation, I shoved him with all my strength. I didn't wait to see his reaction. As soon as I felt his fingers slip from my skin, I turned and ran. Each step was a burst of adrenaline. The sound of my own internal screams mixed with the noise of the footsteps behind me, now disordered, as if he too was beginning to lose control. I knew he was close. I could almost feel his breath on my neck. But the sight of my door, the last barrier between me and what seemed to be the embodiment of my worst nightmare, kept me going. I reached my apartment door with a final effort, the key already in hand, but the pressure of the moment made me lose precision. My hands were shaking so much that I couldn't fit the key into the lock, and with each failed attempt, the panic grew. I knew he was getting closer. I could feel his presence swelling behind me. When I finally managed to turn the key and open the door, I threw myself inside, almost falling to the floor, and slammed the door shut, locking it with every available lock. I backed away from the door, my whole body trembling with exhaustion and terror, and listened to the deadly silence that followed. There were no sounds of footsteps, no heavy breathing. Just silence, oppressive and suffocating. I knew he was out there, somewhere, but the fact that I couldn't hear or see him made everything even more terrifying. I leaned against the wall, trying to control my breathing and comprehend what had just happened. But the only thing that came to mind was the look in his eyes, that smile that now seemed like a warning of what could have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. Even being inside my house, with the door locked, I couldn't feel safe. Something inside me told me that this wasn't over yet, that the nightmare was far from over. My legs finally gave out, and I slid down the wall to the floor. My lungs still struggled to draw in air, as if the terror had tightened around my throat. My hands still trembled uncontrollably as I reached for my phone in my pocket. Dialing the number for the police felt like a Herculean task, but I knew I had to do it. The voice of the dispatcher on the other end sounded distant, as if I were in a tunnel. I told them everything that had happened, trying to keep my voice steady, but it was impossible to hide the panic. I described the customer, his clothes, his face, that disturbing smile. Every word I spoke made the fear seem more real, more palpable. The police assured me that a patrol car was on its way, but each second that passed while I waited felt like an eternity. When the police finally arrived, the relief I felt was brief. They searched the area around the house, combed through the dark streets and shadows that seemed to swallow me just minutes before. But they found no one. No sign of the man who had chased me. It was as if he had evaporated, vanished into the night, leaving only the trail of my terror behind. The officers tried to calm me, said they would patrol the area, but the emptiness in their words only reinforced the sense of helplessness I felt. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise, no matter how small, made me jump in fear. The ticking of the clock sounded like distant footsteps, the creaking of the floorboards like the echo of someone approaching. I closed all the curtains, locked all the windows, but none of it seemed enough to shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. In the days that followed, life was supposed to return to normal. I was supposed to go back to work at the cafe, supposed to be able to move on. But I couldn't. Every time the cafe door opened, my heart raced. Every new face that entered made the blood run cold in my veins. But the customer never appeared again. It was as if he had dissipated into the darkness, just like that night. Yet, the relief of not seeing him didn't bring the peace I had hoped for. What remained was the fear, constant and relentless. The fear that he might show up at any moment, that he was just waiting for the right time to return. At night, the feeling of being watched intensified, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, trying to see someone in the shadows, someone who might not even be there. The terror of that night infiltrated every aspect of my life. My sleep became short and plagued by nightmares, where the customer returned to chase me through deserted streets, his smile widening more and more, until I woke up, gasping for air and drenched in cold sweat. I knew something inside me had changed forever. It wasn't just the memory of that night that haunted me, but the realization that danger could be lurking at any moment, anywhere. Living with this constant shadow over me was like carrying an unbearable weight. The customer may have physically disappeared, but his presence, his fixed gaze, and that sinister smile had etched themselves into my mind, turning every moment of my life into a reminder that he could return. And if he did, I didn't know if I would have the strength to escape again.